Hey everyone, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 63rd episode of the Writ Podcast. So it was a big win on Monday night for François Legault in the CEQ, but it was also a pretty big win for the polls. They were very close to the mark, and one of the polling firms that has been really close to the mark for the last few elections has been Léger. So to chat with me today about what happened on Monday, but also just how Léger goes about doing its polling, I'm joined today by Christian Bourque, Executive Vice President at Léger. Hello, Christian.
Hi there.
So it was a good night for François Legault, clearly, but it was also a pretty good night for the Pollsters. Now, there wasn't a lot of surprises on Monday night, and maybe that is a bit of a testament to, that the polls were pretty close. Even at the riding level, there weren't that many huge upsets or things that struck me as surprising. But if there was any big surprises for you, what was it on Monday night?
Well, there's not necessarily surprises, but there were sort of big unknowns heading into the last weekend. One was with the Conservative Party of Quebec. It's a brand new party, had zero organization just 3 months ago on the ground. And we were seeing them poll in the mid-teens throughout the campaign and heading into the campaign itself. But our big question was, are they going to go and vote? Looking at who that clientele is traditionally, and seeing what happened with the vote for Bernier last time in the federal election, where a lot of that potential did not turn out on election night, we were worried the same thing might happen to the Conservatives, but did not actually. They voted pretty much in the same way that pollsters had predicted.
Yeah, and they came pretty close in the two ridings in the Beauce, which maybe Maxime Bernier is going to look at that as a positive thing for next time. But yeah, it did kind of play out a lot as expected. So the final poll that Léger had was 38% for the CQ, 17% for the Liberals, 15% for QS and the Parti Québécois, 14% for the Conservatives. And the result was 41% for the CQ, 15% for the QS, and the PQ, 14% for the Liberals, 13% for the Conservatives. So it was very close. But I'm curious to have your take on what might have been behind the little bit of the overestimation of the Liberal vote and the underestimation of the CAQ vote, because that thing kind of happened again in 2018 as well.
Yeah, I think traditionally, when we look at polling in Quebec, the issue has always been before that, that polls tended to underestimate the Liberal vote. There was something called the Ballot Box Bonus, made famous by Premier Bourassa, of course, saying that in that sort of last weekend, there's a couple of points of people who were discreet in polling that actually turn out to vote for the stability option or the federalist option in this particular case. And now, because of the axis in Quebec politics is changing more to a left-right alignment than to a yes-no alignment, slowly we're finding that ballot box bonus is not present. And now we actually face the opposite, is we tend to somewhat overestimate the Liberal vote altogether. When we look past 2018, where all the pollsters, and the difference was beyond the margin of error in 2018 for the Liberal vote, is we look at participation by riding or at the riding level. And our concern at this election was, again, we would be faced with the same phenomenon, which is a lot of English language voters and allophone voters, those who don't have as their mother tongue either English or French, basically, if they're disappointed with the Liberals or don't actually believe in the Liberals' chances, they tend to stay home more than anything else. And again, we saw the same thing. I was looking at the ridings on election night. Darcy McGee, which, of course, has always been Liberal and likely will be, but we were seeing that they were winning the seats with 9,000 to 10,000 votes, where that used to be 25,000, 30,000 votes for the Liberals. Is that a lot of those Liberals, some of them went to the Conservatives, some of them went to Québec Solidaire, but really most of them just basically did not turn out. So participation at the riding level explains part of the difference, both on the CAQ side, because it's mostly sort of Francophone vote-rich CAQ versus Anglo/allophone vote-rich Liberals who did not turn out. So that's part of the difference that we actually saw on Monday, and the total collapse of the Liberal vote among Francophones. When we were polling them at 6 or 7 or 8% among Francophone voters, would that actually turn out as well? So turnout is a big issue when it comes to the Liberal vote. Where on the CAQ we were a tad worried at 38% when this is what the survey said, not to quote Bob Barker or whatever it is, Family Feud. But when we actually looked in our last survey at those who said they had voted in advance polling, and we looked at voting intention by only with the advanced polls, we did see that the CAQ was almost half of those who had voted in advance had voted for the CAQ. So we said, okay, what does that mean for election night? Does it mean that they will get all their vote to turn out, that they're actually doing better than we might have suspected? And that's a little bit what happened as well on Monday night.
Yeah, I don't know because we don't really know when Elections Quebec is reporting some of the numbers where they're coming from. But in a number of ridings, if you followed the sort of the poll by poll coming in of the vote, a lot of the ridings where the CQ was up against the Liberals, they were often way ahead at the beginning of the count, and then it started to get a little tighter. There was a point in the evening where I think they were at 92, 93 seats, and then they ended up losing a couple of them to the Liberals. And I think it was in part because that advance vote might have been counted first, and it just showed how much of an advantage they had there. And like you said, when I was looking at some of the turnout in like Nelligan or Jacques Cartier, ridings like that, it was often about 58% or so, but turnout in Quebec as a whole was somewhere around 66, 67. So it does suggest that in some of those Liberal ridings, turnout would have been a bit lower. So I guess a question then would be, when you're looking at your final poll, do you think about that and whether any adjustments need to be made?
Well, in the last few elections, we do make a little bit of an adjustment. We weight by traditional variables, and then we do ours over the web, of course, using our panel. So we will weight by age, region, language, education now, presence of children in the household that we've added as a weighting variable because web panels tend to be or tend to over-index on single person dwellings. So we also correct for presence of children in the household. And what we've added is basically using three fairly simple questions that we actually now have an extra weighting variable, which is a probability of voting that we've added in. So we don't exclude people per se, but we basically weight them down if we suspect they probably will not be voting. So we wanted to take into account the impact of turnout on the final numbers. Now, when we look at sort of at our traditional weighting and the final weighting using probability of vote, it basically makes a 1% difference plus or minus for each of the different parties. So it's not extreme. It doesn't really modify the landscape all that much, but we believe it has that extra sort of ounce of accuracy at the very end. And it's fairly simple. What's the date of the election? If you can't think of the date, you're likely will not be voting. Then we have sort of declared probability of voting that we use as well. And the third one is to what extent you would feel guilty if for some reason you were not able to vote. So adding those three variables together gives us a weight on probability of vote that, again, it doesn't really have a huge impact on the final numbers, but a point here and there sometimes makes the difference between being within the margin of error for most, if not all parties, or a little bit outside. But that's the only difference, really, from the raw weighted data using sociodemographics.
Okay, so let's take it back, not just looking at this election. There's a couple elections now. The Léger has been quite close. So let's go down to the beginning, right? What do you think is behind the success that your polling firm has had in the last few elections, particularly these big elections where the stakes are usually pretty high?
Yeah. I think it's been a good period for pollsters in Canada altogether. So I mean, and as a member of the industry, if the industry does well, then everybody does well, and we're all good. The worst would be sort of these guys got it right, but all the other ones did not. I mean, that would not really be beneficial for the industry. So on Monday night again, the industry won. Jokingly, we were saying Canada did much better than Brazil on Monday night. So from that perspective, anyways, it's been a good period for Canadian pollsters altogether, and it is also a weird period because I mean, three fundamentally different methodologies are going at the same with the same objective of being close. So doing telephone, IVR, and web. And really, we're seeing sort of slowly sort of a convergence of the different methods as everybody has access to the web and as all methods get refined over time. I think for us, we it's basically size of the panel. So, for example, in Quebec, where we have about 200,000 members of our panel, the chances of finding a random sample within that large panel that actually makes sense, that actually looks like the Canadian or the Quebec population, is much easier than in the panel was very, very small. Then you have to trust that, you know, out of that it's not only about randomness anymore. If you draw a random sample from a very small universe of potential respondents, so size of the panel is one of the explanation. We also now toss in quality control variables that we make sure that we exclude people or potential robots, potential fraudsters, potential straight liners. So I mean the actual quality controls of web-based research have improved over time as well, which I guess gives us more confidence. Plus, given that it's our panel, in the middle of the campaign, we decided to have a much larger sample of over 3,000 people because we're not paying somebody else to do it, so we can afford to do it internally. It's our own money. Sort of being used to good service. So from that larger survey in the mid-campaign, we basically felt the next time we draw a random sample of 1,000 from our panel and we sort of look back at the week before where we had 3,000, we can sort of see if the regions are well balanced, if if the Eastern Quebec all of a sudden showed a plus 20 for the Liberals, we would have said, whoops, something's wrong. So the fact that we can draw bigger samples at different periods of time during the campaign also gives us more confidence. Other than that, it's basically using the same questions over time, using the same team of researchers that have worked on these now for 20 odd years. At some point, you know when you can trust your data. The other thing as well that we're finding over the last few elections is that there are not sort of wide variances in how people will vote over short periods of time. And like I don't remember. 2015 was probably the example where we saw the most impressive shift of voter support over a short period, from the leading NDP to the winning Liberals at the end. And mind you, in 2015, the industry got it right. We collectively underestimated a little bit the push for the Liberals at the very end. And you remember doing seat projections back then in 2015. Heading into the last weekend, we all got that feeling that the Liberals had taken off, but I mean, polls predict the past. It was hard to actually see where they would end up, but even then, the pollsters got it right. So sometimes, if your poll on week one gives you a part of the story, on week two, why would that story had really changed that much? So there are no plus tens or minus tens over a 7-day period unless something happened in it. I mean, it did not even happen when blackface, for example, if we recall, again, a federal election, but everybody thought, oh, that's it. I mean, we'll see a massive change in support in Canada. Basically, voting intentions barely blinked over that period. So as well, consistency over periods is something that when you look at your data, you say, why would there be a +3 there or a -3? You need to be able to explain those variances, but we don't see the peaks and valleys. Sometimes when you look at other companies polling during a campaign, and you're thinking, why is this -8 there? What happened over a week where people would flip so easily between their allegiances? Mostly what we're finding is polling tends to be fairly stable over short periods over time, and again adds to the confidence that you can have in your numbers if you can easily explain away those usually smaller, even often within the margin of error variances over in 7 or 10-day periods.
Does it ever happen then when you get a new set of data and you're expecting something and nothing changes. Like, does that ever happen? Like, there was a big debate, everybody thought this person won or lost, and then your data comes in and it's +1 or exactly the same as last week. Does that ever
Yeah,
make you
well,
wonder?
yeah. Well, the problem is both federally and provincially here in Quebec is that over time there's more options or more viable options where people can actually park their votes in surveys that discrepancies are not that huge. After the first French language debate where everybody said, oh, Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon did a fabulous job. We might see a bounce back in PQ support. And some of that, of course, will eat away at support for the CAQ. And then we were all excited and +2, -2. That was basically it. But I, then you go back and say, well, why would QS supporters all of a sudden want to vote for the Parti Québécois while those parties are so different on a host of core issues? Um, so it had no impact on QS. Why would liberal voters decide to vote PQ because PSPP did a good job on a debate? I mean, the net impact we should anticipate should be fairly small, and indeed it was. But again, because we like following elections, we all of a sudden thought, oh wow, can't wait till our next survey, and then it's a bit of a downer when there's only a point or two in each direction.
Let's go back to maybe the basics of you mentioned Léger having a very large panel. How do you actually get people to participate in the panel, recruit people, and ensure that you're not recruiting the same kind of people? You mentioned how there might be a little bit of over-representation of people who live by themselves. How do you make sure that you have a sample and a panel that is representative more than just maybe the stranger kind of person that wants to take part in polls?
Yeah. 10 years ago, it was fairly simple. We would basically recruit our panel off of our telephone surveys. So at the end of the survey, if the client allowed us, we would ask a question. If you would like to answer other surveys like these over the internet, leave us your email address. Then we would go through the double opt-in process. Of course, that's mandatory that you basically follow all the laws to respect Canadians' privacy. But that was easy. So 75 to 80% of our panel used to be recruited using telephone surveys. But the fewer telephone surveys we actually do in our call center, we still have a call center, but we're not doing in terms of volume as much as we used to. We needed to rely on other techniques. Now we use, traditional media in traditional or advertising in traditional media, sorry, to try to recruit. We use as well digital media campaigns off of Facebook, Instagram, now TikTok. We've got campaigns on TikTok where we solicit people to sign up. As soon as they sign up and that we do have permission to send them survey research, then they go through a couple of initial surveys, which are basically just to classify them within the panel. So as soon as they're assessed their individual password, that we verify that they're an actual human being responding to these surveys, then we go through the full list of who they are, from sociodemographics to if they suffer from any chronic diseases, types of beer they drink, and there's about 60 or 70 variables altogether that we measure. And then based on those, we can basically assess to what extent they are like or unlike other people. So we do have quite of an extensive list of variables that or stuff that we know of our panel. When we go back to them for a survey, for example, we will ask a few of these questions again to verify that Jim at hotmail.ca is actually Jim answering the survey. Plus, we ask questions. What's the color of Napoleon's white horse type to verify that as well that they're paying attention in the survey. But because we know a lot of stuff about them from the get-go, we do sort of have confidence that the panel is just average Canadians answering surveys. Where panels tend to overrepresent also has changed. It used to be 10, 15 years ago that it was weighted heavily towards younger Canadians, higher education, higher income, because at that time, not everybody had access to the internet. Now that it's become, I think 93, 94% of Canadians now who have internet access. according to StatsCan. We're not finding that bias anymore. And now our panel actually overrepresents the same cohorts that are overrepresented in telephone surveys, which is 45 to 64-year-old women. They're the same people that basically yeah, willingly accept to give their opinions. So now we actually struggle to represent 18 to 24-year-old men, for example, which would be the same struggle in traditional methodologies like telephone interviewing.
So that would explain the TikTok campaign.
Well, of course, yeah, we're always trying. It's hard. It's hard to recruit them. It's hard to get them to participate as well in research.
When you dip into the panel, is it done in a way that it's targeted so that you have like a quota system, or that you send invitations out to specific groups within these demographics as you've classified them, or is it
Yep.
more that you send it out to everybody and then you kind of cull it?
No, it's very similar to stratified sampling using traditional telephone methodology. So we stratify according to region, and then within a region by gender, age, and I think it's gender, age, and income. So when we push out invitations, the sample is already fairly balanced, except for subgroups that we know we need to oversample. So we'll send more invitations to younger age cohorts than we would older age cohorts, which tend to have better response rates to web surveys. So the whole thing is stratified before going into field. So if, for example, we send 4 or 5,000 invitations to where we target a sample of 1,000, we know that once we get it back, the weighting that we actually impose on that sample is actually not, or it doesn't make that much of a difference because it was sort of stratified going in.
Okay, and when you do the weighting, is there you did mention the whether it was single household, that kind of thing, and education. Those are different things than in the past, right? Because weighting by education, for example, I know is something that in the United States they started to do, particularly after some of the misses with Donald Trump. So these weighting decisions are informed by past experience in terms of
Yeah.
how accurate the polls have been.
Yeah, and I'd say to make a long story short, the thing we are always concerned about doing interviewing on the web is will the panel be left leaning? Left leaning as in slightly higher income, slightly higher education, slightly more urban than rural, which basically gives you a left leaning panel. So that's why we introduced these new weighting variables. Because, of course, if you overrepresent single person dwellings of young people in their early 30s who make a good living because they all have a master's in something, you'll have a left-leaning panel. So the concern is that so the sort of certain miscues about who participates in research translates into political variables is something that is of a concern. And so you did see this bias in the United States, and you're right. Some corrections were made, but even in the last one in 2020, there was still a bit of a left-leaning bias in a lot of what was a lot of the polling in the United States. So it is improving over time. Um, but yeah, so the weighting algorithm, it only gets more complex as we move through time.
Right. Yeah. So let's move on to just maybe some broader kind of thoughts about things. So Léger has been working in Quebec in particular with the Journal de Montréal, TVA. How do you find that relationship has evolved? Not the specific relationship, but I mean the relationship between a polling firm like yours and the media.
Well, of course, the big issue with Canadian media is their lack of resources. I think they're all sort of pinching every penny. I think our capacity to do like we used to maybe 15, 20 years ago to say if you want a Léger poll, you need to pay for it in full. Um, a lot of what we do now, because we need those traditional media campaigns to recruit participants, basically we take care of the poll, you give us space in exchange. So it kind of relieves a little bit the burden of media to actually pay in real money for all of these surveys, because I don't believe they can afford it anymore. Or if they can afford it, they're not telling us. Uh, anyway, but we understand money is extremely tight. So that's, I think, the business model of doing panel recruiting and the limited resources of media actually sort of balance each other out, because uh, some of the commodity they have, or the real estate that they have, we can actually use as an investment in terms of panel recruiting. So it's working out okay. Um, but in today's world, to get media to pay in full for a traditional telephone survey, I don't know if it is possible uh, anymore in Canada.
What do you think is the role and responsibility of pollsters during a campaign? Because I hear it, I'm sure you hear it during a campaign. Why do we need these polls? Is it pushing people's opinions? Is it forming opinion rather than measuring opinion? I don't believe that's the case. But what do you think is the responsibility of a pollster when a campaign is
Yeah.
on?
And some of the blame that you're talking about, we got it specifically this time around in Quebec because, well, you guys already called it, right? The 25, 28 point lead of the CAQ coming into the campaign. A lot of people were saying, you'll see turnout will be lower because you told people there was no race. In fact, turnout is okay. I mean, it's 66 point some percent compared to 68 in 2018 when the CAQ won their first majority. So not that bad from that perspective. Uh, you cannot deny that polls have an impact on politics in general and political and election campaigns in particular. I don't know what the size of that impact is. Have we converted some voters to be more strategic about their decision making than they would have otherwise? And if so, is that such a bad thing? I mean, to me, when people look at strategic voting as something that would be bad, I don't get that. And the other aspect as well uh, that pollsters can be blamed for from the broader perspective is how the presence of polling have influenced how media discuss campaigns. It seems to me that over time, this is more like the political scientist speaking than the pollster himself. But it seems when you listen to TV or radio about the campaign is today premier or today party leader X, Y, and Z said this or did this because of or where they're standing in the horse race, as if the horse race dictated everything that politicians do, which I don't believe. I still believe they have core values, beliefs that they actually want to put out to Canadians in these elections. But it seems everything is always interpreted in the media as being related to the horse race. I mean, there's tons of literature on that, of course, but I do think that we've contributed to sort of horse race campaign coverage being more prevalent than it might have used to in the past. Um, but again, I don't think we have a massive impact on the outcome on election night uh, because I, I guess what we measure is how people feel at a point in time. We don't dictate that in any way, shape, or form. And I was looking at longitudinal research done as well. Um, and usually the presence of polls during the campaign has never been seen, or there's no clear indication that it could have changed the storyline. Most of the times, the person that's in the lead heading into the campaign wins. So,
It's often
so the
that
polls
simple, yeah.
during the campaign, did they have that much impact? I don't believe so.
It does bring up the idea of just if you're observing something, if you're measuring something, then just in that way you're impacting it. It's more of a scientific
Of
kind of
course.
thing that, but revealing the information from that measurement will have an impact. But I don't, and I think we probably agree. I don't understand the argument against revealing information because it's better for people to be less aware of what's going on in order to make their decision.
Yeah, and
It's
straw polls have
information, right?
existed. Yeah, straw polls have existed since the 19th century, mostly in the US, because fundamentally, as human beings, we want to know what others are thinking. So if it wasn't polling revealing what others are thinking, who would we rely on? Talk radio hosts?
Neighbors?
Or the old sort of vox pop they used to do in media is basically asking a few people on a street corner who they'll vote for. I mean, what's the alternative to scientific, rigorous, and members of an auto-regulated industry that try to do their best for the industry to do well collectively? I haven't found a better alternative to polling when it comes to revealing how people feel about something.
And absolutely something would replace the vacuum. I remember reading a newspaper article done for the 1935 election before there was polling. And the entire article was talking to reporters and political people in each part of the country and then trying to forecast what the outcome was going to be. So it's not that polling is what created this. People always had this fascination of trying to guess what the outcome was going to be. And I can tell you that those forecasts were really not very close in 1935. No. So let's just finish on this one last thing. So if you are a telephone pollster, you do have the concern of response rates and what that's going to do in the future as people change their habits. What's the concern about the future for online polling? What is it that keeps Léger up at night in terms of what you have to make sure doesn't go badly for your polling?
Yeah, what's gotten more expensive, a lot more expensive, is quality control. Also, panel recruitment is becoming more and more expensive, and also ensuring loyalty in the panel. It used to be that mortality rates were in the sort of low teens. Now we're getting into the 20-odd%. So you constantly need to be recruiting, replacing panelists. So a few years ago, internet research was the cheap alternative to telephone. But now, the level of investment in having a large enough, robust panel is getting extremely expensive. So controlling the cost of quality research on the web is becoming a huge issue, not only for us, but the whole industry.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on to talk with me today, and congratulations on another good call in the Quebec election, and congratulations to your colleagues as well across the industry. So, Christian, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, anytime. Thank you.